Alright, this is our first lesson on the glory that was Rome. Topic 3.1a notes the Roman Republic. By the end of these notes, you should be able to describe the origins of Roman society, how it was structured, and how it expanded. The mythical origins of the Roman Empire or Roman civilization dates back to around 750 BCE when the brothers Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the god Ares or Mars for the Romans, founded the city as the first kings of Rome. However, archaeological evidence shows that people were living in this region way back into the Paleolithic, that's the Old Stone Age. There are really four eras of Roman civilization that we're going to be talking about in this class. The first, very briefly, is the era where they're ruled by kings. The second is this period known as the Roman Republic, which lasts roughly 500 years. The third period is known as the Roman Empire, which lasts about another 500 years. And the fourth era is the Byzantine Empire, which is really just the Eastern Roman Empire, or what's left of the Roman Empire after the western half collapses. Let's start with that first key question: where did Roman civilization even come from? Like all the civilizations we've been talking about, Rome greatly benefits from its geography. The first geographic feature they greatly benefit from is the Tiber River you see right here, which the Roman city is built on. Like all the major rivers we've been talking about in this course, the river provides fertile farmland to produce food for the people of the city. The river also flows into the Mediterranean Sea, providing for access to trade routes. Those 7 hills that the city of Rome was founded on top of provided easy access to see invaders coming from the distance. Now, beyond that protection of the river and the hills, you can see if you look at the geography of the Italian peninsula itself here, that it's protected in the north from the Alps, the tallest mountains in Europe. And then down the spine of the Italian peninsula is the Apennines Mountains, which protects Rome from invasion from the east. So geographically, the mountains provide quite a bit of protection. And then around their 7 original hills, you see these walls built that provide an additional layer of protection for the city. So they're quite well defended. And then there's the fact that the Italian peninsula right here juts right into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And Rome itself is situated kind of right in the middle of the Italian peninsula. This makes it situated in the center of all the crossroads of trade. They're going from west to east and east to west across the Mediterranean Sea, so that's an ideal location for trade routes. There are 4 main groups that give early Rome its character. The first are the Latins, the early settlers of central Italy, and many considered to be the first Romans. So these are really the first people who kind of migrate into the area and start building on these hills. It's from them we get the Latin language that the Romans speak. Second civilization are the Greeks, who you can see right here. This is where Greece is, so it's not too far away, right across the Ionian Sea from mainland Greece. In fact, you remember from our previous unit, this area right here, Sicily and southern Italian peninsula, was known as Greater Greece. So the Romans were in contact with the Greeks, and they inherited a lot when it comes to trade routes, culture. They even gave Greek gods and Greek heroes Latin names. We'll come back to that. The third group were the Etruscans, who were a different civilization that was living north of Rome. So Rome's right here. This kind of dark orange area is kind of the Etruscan area. They ruled over Rome for over 100 years as the kings of the Romans. They were a separate civilization that ruled over the Romans, and the Romans really did not like this. But still, they learned from their oppressors, adopting their writing system and then modifying it, as well as their architecture, technology, and a lot of their culture as well just gets kind of absorbed into Roman culture once they gain independence. And then the fourth group are refugees. Unlike a lot of other cultures who are xenophobic, that means afraid of foreigners, Romans, at least in the early days, really welcomed foreigners to become part of the project that is Rome. You could run away from Greece, you could run away from Egypt, from Carthage, from Hispania. It didn't really matter where you were coming from. You were welcomed into the city of Rome as long as you brought knowledge and were willing to share it. And from this free flow of knowledge and technology, Romans were able to build on that, make it their own, and really build an empire that conquers the entire Mediterranean Sea. That brings us to our next key question. What was Roman society like? And again, we're talking about a period of time that lasts well over 1,000 years. So this is all a real generalization of the specifically 500 years of the Roman Republic. A lot of this changes over time. This is just a generalization. Even during the time of the Republic, Rome had a very strong social hierarchy. Citizens were at the very top of this hierarchy, but not all citizens were created equal. They were broken up into 2 groupings, the patricians and the plebeians. I'll call them the plebs for short, usually. So the patricians were wealthy landowners who inherited their power, and they really held most of the political influence in the Roman Republic. This is because they claimed that their families descended from the very first senators of Rome that established the Republic, and therefore their families should have more power in the Republic. And then there were the plebeians, or the plebs. These were the farmers, merchants, artisans. Most people were plebs or plebeians, and they had very little political power inside the republic. An important distinction here is that wealth and owning land did not move you from a plebeian to a patrician. The only way to become a patrician is to be born into a patrician family. That is, your parents were patricians, so you are a patrician. There was no way to buy into this status. Below these citizens that were the patricians and the plebeians were women and non-citizens. So women from patrician and plebeian family, they couldn't vote or hold office, but they could own property and inherit property from their parents. In fact, in many ways, other than voting and holding office, women had a lot of rights that you wouldn't have seen in other civilizations. Non-citizens are people who are not patrician or plebeian, but they come from outside Rome, they conquered territories, or someone who just moved there but was not a member of the patrician or plebeian class. Again, they were allowed to own property, inherit property, they had rights protected, but they could not vote and they could not hold office. Below women and non-citizens were the enslaved people. These were people who were either captured in war, they sold themselves or were sold into slavery to pay off debt from the family, or they were sentenced to slavery as a punishment. Now, there are some rare situations where you saw wealthy or patricians or people who are free citizens actually selling themselves into slavery, not to pay off debt, but to get the glory of being a gladiator, as gladiators were slaves. But that's not something we're really going to focus on too much in this class, but if you're curious, I encourage you to look into more on your own. Now, the enslaved people in the Roman Empire did really most of the work. In fact, according to some estimates, they made up to at least a third of the population of Rome. And because this hierarchy was so strict and based on birth, especially between patricians and plebeians, there were very strict laws against intermarriage of patricians and plebeians. This was to prevent the weakening of the patrician power. After all, if you had a patrician marry a plebeian, then would the child be patrician or would they be plebeian? So these laws against intermarriage between patricians and plebeians very much mirror the very same racist laws you see later in the United States that ban black people and white people from getting intermarried because of the complications of the social hierarchy that's created when you have a child that is a mixed social groups. As far as religion goes, the Romans basically just adopted the Greek pantheon of gods and changed their names. Here you can say Zeus has his name changed to Jupiter, Hera to Juno, Hades to Pluto, Poseidon to Neptune, Ares to Mars, Aphrodite to Venus. You're kind of seeing where we're getting a lot of the planet names from. They also adopted many of the heroes from Greek culture and Greek myth. For instance, the Greeks called this hero, you might be familiar from a Disney cartoon, Heracles, because his main opponent in the myths is his stepmother Hera, but the Romans changed his name and call him Hercules. And while they worshipped these gods, it really wasn't the biggest focus of their life. Yes, it was important to do your religious rituals to the pantheon of gods, but there really was, especially in the Republic, more of a focus on civic legends that promoted how to be a good citizen of the Republic through the morals told in those stories. One of the more famous ones was of the general Cincinnatus, seen right here. The story goes that the city of Rome was under siege by barbarians, and so the Senate voted to turn Cincinnatus into a dictator, granting him all powers in the Republic. Now, he did everything he could to save the Republic from the barbarian horde, and then he returned the power to the Senate, giving it all back and giving up all power for himself, and returned to a life of farming rather than keeping the power for himself. The moral of this story being that people should put the Republic above their own self-interest, just as Cincinnatus did. He could have remained dictator and named himself King of Rome, but instead, he put the values of the Republic ahead of himself, gave the power back to the elected Senate, and retired to a private life of farming where he could tend to his own crops. This story was supposed to be a model for all Roman citizens to follow. We got a little ahead of ourselves talking about dictatorships, but let's talk about how they governed themselves with their innovative government system. Romans were very influenced by the teachings of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, the teacher of Alexander. Aristotle essentially said that if you let anyone do whatever they want, you got chaos. Out of that chaos, one person will take control and they will become a king or a monarch. But over time, the stability and peace, a lot of more people will want to share in that power, and that's when you get wealthy and powerful families. The aristocracy will take over, and you'll go from a monarchy to an aristocracy. As things unfold, eventually more and more people will want a say in the government, and it will become a democracy where the people will have direct say in over all the laws. But Aristotle, like his teacher Plato, said that will eventually lead to a fall into chaos, which will then result in a return to monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and so the chaos cycle will continue. Romans thought they had a way out of this. The structure of the Roman Republic's government changes a lot over its 500-year history, but here's a generalization in that essentially all power flows from the assemblies, which is where the patricians and plebeians meet to vote, and then they choose the leaders who then decide things for them. One of the core features of the Roman Republic was the 12 Tables, which you can think of a lot of like the US Constitution today or Hammurabi's Code. These were written laws that ensured the equal treatment of all free citizens. The overall goal of the 12 Tables was to ease the tensions between the patricians who ran most things and the plebeians who were citizens but still had limited rights. So the 12 Tables were created so that everyone knew whose rights were what and what rights couldn't be violated. On the 12 Tables was the assembly. This is where patricians and plebeians got together to vote on laws, senators, and other things as well, right? So there's a ballot box here. Kind of like Athens had a direct democracy, but the plebeians and the patricians could vote on some laws directly, but really most major laws were passed by the Senate, which is 300 patricians elected by the assembly to make those laws, manage the republic, and advise the councils. So this is where we have the birth of the system that we have here in America, which is a representative democracy, where we don't vote on all the laws directly. Instead, we vote on our leaders who then make decisions for us. Then there were the councils, who were like the co-presidents who commanded the armies of Rome and implemented the laws of the Senate and the assembly. They were elected by the assembly, or one of the assemblies. I'm not going to go into the details of all the different assemblies the Romans had. Just know that one of the assemblies elected the councils. They served for 1 year, and by tradition, they could not be elected again for another 10 years. This is to prevent them from becoming kings. However, the Romans realized sometimes there were real existential crises or threats to the existence of the Republic, and in order to solve that, they needed to give up their Republic and give all the power to a dictator, a single ruler chosen during a time of crisis. Generally, the Senate would vote to elevate one of the two councils to the status of dictator, and they would have the power to create any laws they want, get rid of any laws they want, had direct control of the legions. However, by tradition, they would return that power to the Senate within 6 months or when the crisis was solved, whichever came first. That brings us to the Roman Forum, which was the center of Roman life. The Forum, as you can see what it looks like here today, or what it would look like in its prime, was an area that contained markets for shopping, but it was also where the assemblies were held and political debates were held, so that everyone could participate and fully see what was going on in their government while getting their daily shopping needs met. And then there's the Mos Maiorum, my Latin's a little rusty, I apologize, which means way of the elder. These were traditions, but not laws. Simply, these were the normal things that people had followed to help the Republic function, even though they were not required to by law. For instance, you didn't carry weapons inside the city, dictators gave their power back after 6 months, you never committed violence against elected officials, and under no circumstance would you run for re-election, as that was a sign you were trying to become a king. Alright, let's move on to talk about how the Roman civilization was able to expand beyond the borders of its city. Predictably, at the core of this was the Roman army. Now, the Roman army was made up of mostly the Roman legions. Legions were a group of 5,000 soldiers divided into smaller groupings called centuries that were made up of about 80 men. Now, the Roman legions didn't just fight, they also built roads and forts that connected areas they conquered to the city of Rome to make it easier to control them, but, as we've been talking about over and over again, also supports trade between Rome and the cities that are connected by those roads. The consuls were the commander-in-chief of the military, but other command positions could only be held by other patricians, not plebeians. The vast majority of the Roman legions were actually made up of plebeians who had to serve in the military as a form of tax if they owned land inside the Republic. By the year 264 BCE, the Romans controlled most of the Italian peninsula. For reference, that's around 60 years after the death of Alexander the Great. As Romans conquered their neighbors on the Italian peninsula, they treated most of them mostly fairly. Some were allowed to become citizens, where others became dependent allies. The Roman legions would build roads connecting these cities for trade, but also those roads made it much easier for the Roman legions to march to a city that wasn't quite playing by the Roman rules to put them back in their place. However, where we're going to start this story is the Punic Wars, which kicks off in 264 BCE when the Romans have pretty much the control over the Italian peninsula. Their main rival is the city of Carthage here across the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is a smaller part of the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage was a trade city that was at the heart of Phoenician culture after Alexander destroyed the city of Tyre, roughly about 60, 70 years before that. Now, the fact that they were Phoenicians will tell you a couple things. Number one, they're very interested in trade, and number two, they're really good at sailing. Their real power came from its control of trade routes. You can see all these trade routes from across the east and the western Mediterranean, converging right here in Carthage and on the island of Sicily, which they controlled, and they had a powerful navy that kept these trade routes safe and gave them control of it. However, their city itself was also walled, giving them quite a bit of protection. And really, the only way into the city by sea was through the Great Carthaginian Harbor, which was absolutely massive. So you can see here, before the First Punic War, Rome pretty much controls the Italian peninsula and the southern part of the boot, which was part of Greater Greece. Here you can see Carthage controls most of the island of Sicily, where those trade routes were connecting, as well as the islands of Corsica and Sardinia over here, a little bit of Hispania, which we'll be talking more about in future lessons, and a lot of the north coast of Africa, with Egypt being over here, not really part of the story yet. Well, if you look at the second map here, the war ends with Rome kind of victorious. They gain control of the island of Sicily, the entire island, as well as the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, which gives them control of a lot of these trade routes thanks to them stopping in Sicily. Whereas Carthage expands its control up into mid to northern Hispania, and that's going to be playing a bigger role in the next phase of this war. The Carthaginians weren't going to take this defeat laying down, especially their top general, Hamilcar Barca. Now, Hamilcar had a son named Hannibal, and trained Hannibal from a very young age to harbor a grudge against the city of Rome, and it was even said that he made his son swear an oath at the altar of one of the gods to one day destroy the city of Rome. Well, young Hannibal grows up, and he spends a lot of time over in Hispania, and he begins to raise an army of about 30,000 more soldiers, including an army of war elephants that are being bred over here, right? They're elephants in Africa, and he breeds them up here in Hispania, and his plan is to march around Hispania through this territory called Gaul, which is going to be coming up in another lesson, across the Alps, which were supposed to protect the Romans, into the Italian peninsula in order to attack the city of Rome. Well, he gets into the Italian peninsula around 218 BCE and spends the next 15 years just rampaging across the Italian peninsula, destroying pretty much every Roman army he comes across, but is unable to take or get into the city of Rome itself, and he's basically a 15-year-long nuisance for Rome and its allies. Finally, Rome decides to counter by taking their forces and sailing to Carthage instead of trying to fight Hannibal's armies in the Italian peninsula. The Romans take their armies to the city of Carthage, and they attack the city of Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to make a decision: either stay in the Italian peninsula, causing havoc for the Romans, or go back to Carthage to defend his city that's under siege. Hannibal decided to go home to protect Carthage, and wound up losing terribly to the Romans in this, and then sailed east in exile, where he eventually died of poisoning because he was afraid the Romans were going to capture him and bring him back for trial. As punishment, the Romans pretty much take everything that was of Carthage, right? Before the Second Punic War, you see this purple is Carthage controlled, but afterwards, you see Carthage really only controls its city and the farmlands, the immediate lands around the city, whereas Rome takes everything else. Carthage was also had to pay Rome a huge ransom that the Romans thought would take decades for the Carthaginians to pay off. They were also banned from ever having an army of their own, so they couldn't form a challenge to the Romans. So you can see here, after the Second Punic War, Rome really has a empire starting to build. Even though it's a republic, it's starting to build an empire here with colonies in Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, as well as Hispania and northern Africa. This all really sets up the third and final Punic War, because Carthage was able to pay off that ransom extremely fast, and that upset the Romans. It turns out when you don't have to worry about paying for colonies or a massive navy, and you could just rely on the Roman navy to patrol the Mediterranean to keep the trade routes open, you can make a lot of money just by being merchants. So they were able to pay off that ransom exceedingly fast, and the Romans got really upset about this. And they also were worried that the Carthaginians were secretly trying to rearm themselves to fight Rome for control of the trade routes again. This was not happening. So Rome mounted an army, sailed across the Mediterranean, and destroyed the city of Carthage. They tore down any remaining buildings, the walls, they poured salt into the farmland so that no crops could ever grow there again, and they sold any survivors, women and children, into slavery, men, most of which were slaughtered. You can see today, this is what's left of the city of Carthage, whereas this is what the city of Rome looks like today. You can really see who won this war. So Rome is now the unchallenged power across the Mediterranean Sea. The question becomes now, though, because you can see here they've also conquered part of Greece, what does a republic, a representative democracy, how do they run themselves? And those problems are the ones that we're going to be exploring in our next lesson in class, and will eventually lead to the end of the republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. All right, reach the end, rewrite today's goal, those three important facts, and one question you still have, and we'll see you in class.